All right, let's talk about populism and gender. At first glance, you might think they're two totally separate things. But what happens when they collide? Well, you get this really complex, kind of a surprising relationship that actually tells us a ton about the world we're living in right now.
So let's just dive right into the big question, right? Is populism an ally or an enemy to women's rights? And as you probably already figured out, the answer is definitely not a simple yes or no. Oh no, it is way more tangled and frankly, a lot more fascinating than that.
Okay, so before we go any further, we need to be on the same page about what populism even is. We're going to use a definition from political scientists Cass Mudd and Cristobal Rivera Kaltwasser. They call it a thin-centered ideology. Basically, the whole idea is this moral battle, right? It's the pure people versus the corrupt elite. And for populists, politics should just be a pure expression of what the people want. Now, really lock this definition in your brain, because it is the key to unlocking everything else we're going to talk about.
All right, first up, let's look at the voters. I mean, who's actually casting a ballot for these populist parties? And is there a real difference between men and women when they do?
So the common wisdom, and it's backed up by a lot of data, especially out of Europe, is that there's a pretty clear gender gap. The research time and again seems to show that men are just more likely to vote for populist, radical right parties than women are.
Just look at these numbers here. This is from the 2009 European election studies. On a scale of 0 to 10 for supporting these parties, men on average score a 2.32. Women are at 2.00. Now, okay, that's not some massive canyon between them, but it's a real, consistent, and statistically significant gap that pops up in a lot of different countries.
But just when you think, okay, I get it, men vote for them more, well, the story does what it always seems to do in politics. It gets complicated, really complicated.
Yeah, that gap, it's not some universal rule. I mean, you look at France and Austria, and it's basically not even there. Then you shift over to left-wing populism in Latin America, and that clear pattern completely vanishes. And even when you try to explain it with stuff like age or class or how much education someone has, it only gets you part of the way there. The main takeaway here is that there's something much, much deeper going on than just who's checking a box on a ballot.
Okay, so if the voters aren't giving us the full picture, what about the leaders? I mean, we've all seen this rise of really prominent female populist leaders. But does having a woman in the top spot automatically mean things get better for women? This gets into the idea of representation, but maybe not in the way you'd think.
So, there's this political theorist, Hannah Pitkin, who came up with two incredibly useful ways to think about this: descriptive versus substantive representation. Descriptive is pretty simple. Do the politicians actually look like the people they're supposed to represent? So a woman in office, that's descriptive representation. But substantive, now that's the real test. Do they act for those people? Are they actually passing policies that make women's lives better? That's the million-dollar question.
Let's take Argentina as a case study. On the surface, it looks like populism was amazing for women's descriptive representation, right? I mean, back in the 1940s, under Perón, women got the right to vote. Fast forward to 1991, they pass a gender parity law for their legislature. And then in 2007, the country elects its first ever woman president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Looks like a pretty straightforward story of progress, doesn't it?
But then, you have to look at the promise versus the reality. The promise? A female president. That is a huge symbolic win, great descriptive representation. The reality, though? At that same time, more than half of all women in Argentina didn't have basic labor benefits. And that, right there, is a massive failure of substantive representation. See the difference? Having a woman at the top didn't automatically lift all the other boats.
And it actually goes even deeper than that. When these populist movements do put women in powerful jobs, their roles often get framed in these really traditional, feminine ways. You know, they're put in charge of things like health, education, social welfare, all seen as natural extensions of a woman's caregiving role. So instead of breaking new ground, this can end up just reinforcing old stereotypes.
And all of this brings us right to the heart of the matter, the core ideological fight. It's really a clash between two completely different ideas of what a woman's role in society should even be, what we'll call the feminine versus the feminist.
So inside this populist ideology, there's this huge divide. On one side, you have the feminine. This is what gets praised, what gets celebrated. It's all about motherhood, sacrifice, dedication to the community. It's seen as authentic, as the real people. But then, on the other side, you have the feminist. And this is often what gets rejected. This idea values things like individualism, personal freedom, and self-development.
And populists will often paint this as some kind of elitist, foreign idea, a bourgeois distraction from the real problems.
So you gotta ask, why? Why did they do this? This quote from the incredible writer Umberto Eco just hits the nail on the head. He says that because a whole country of people can't possibly have one single will, the leader has to pretend to be their interpreter. And here's the key. Populism needs one single unified people. Individual struggles, individual identities, the very things at the heart of feminism, they threaten to break that unity apart. So the leader has to be the only voice that matters.
And you can see this ideology playing out in totally different ways depending on where you look. In Latin America, for example, women's participation is often encouraged, but it's to help with things like social programs, basically taking their maternal duties and extending them out into the public for the cause. But then you look at Europe, and the tactic can be completely different. There, you'll see populist radical right parties grabbing the language of gender equality, but using it to push an anti-immigration agenda. They'll portray immigrant cultures as backward on women's rights and position themselves as the true defenders of modern women. It's a fascinating and very different approach.
Okay, so let's tie all of this together. The answer to that big question we started with, ally or enemy, it isn't about whether populism is always good or always bad for women. The real key here is context. It is not about consistency.
Remember that definition from the beginning? Let's go back to it one last time. Populism is a thin-centered ideology. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a political chameleon. It just attaches itself to whatever the local cultural norms are, whatever the biggest political issues of the day are in that place. And that's why its position on gender can look so wildly different from one country to the next.
So you can almost map out a kind of populist playbook when it comes to gender. Step 1, you mirror whatever the local culture already thinks about gender roles. You don't challenge it. Step 2, you champion those traditional feminine roles, the mother, the guardian of the family, as the most authentic and pure form of womanhood. And then, step 3, you frame any kind of individualistic, feminist struggle as something that's elitist, foreign, and totally out of touch with the real people.
And that leaves us with one last, and I think really important question to chew on. If populism really is a mirror, if it reflects the societies where it takes root, then what is its really complicated, often contradictory stance on gender tell us about our own societies today? What are the underlying tensions, the unresolved debates about gender, that it's holding up for all of us to see? That's definitely something to think about.